honourable member for Surrey North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much. I rise today on behalf of my constituents from Surrey North to speak to Bill C-461, the CBC and Public Service Disclosure and Transparency Act. Bill C-461 is a blatant attack on the CBC's ability to remain competitive and independent, which the Conservative government has tried to cloak with language of transparency. The Canadian public will not be served by the changes proposed by this bill. The only beneficiary will be the CBC's competitors. How is it, Mr. Speaker, that federal government, which while demonstrating a trend of greater secrecy and less transparency, can ask for exactly the opposite from everyone else? In a stunning display of hypocrisy, the Conservatives continue to demand near limitless disclosure from First Nations, labour unions, and now the CBC, while they simultaneously refuse to disclose the number of employees in the PMO who earn over $100,000. If the Conservative government was truly interested in transparency, it would have supported the original salary disclosure measures in this bill. Instead, during the Ethics Committee study of the bill, the Conservatives gutted these provisions by raising the minimum income to allow for full salary disclosure for federal employees from $188,600 to $444,661 annually. Mr. Speaker, this amendment that they introduced during committee is designed to effectively neutralize Bill C-61's salary disclosure measures, and rather than supporting transparency as the name of this bill suggests, the Conservatives are doing exactly the opposite. By gutting the salary disclosure provisions proposed in this bill, the Conservatives are at it yet again, Mr. Speaker. They are demonstrating their aversion to any measure of actually true transparency. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the Canadians are wondering why the Conservatives voted to raise the salary disclosure threshold. Certainly there must be a valid rationale behind this particular decision. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry to disappoint the Canadians searching for this answer. A reasonable explanation from this government but there doesn't seem to be one, Mr. Speaker. In fact, the Federal Director of Canadian Taxpayers Federation noted that not one witness nor one committee member even spoke to why increasing the threshold was a good idea. I have to say, Mr. Speaker, that I agree with the Director's prediction that this was probably because they couldn't think of even one good reason to justify their action. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives are demonstrating that they are nothing if not consistent in this position. Over the past few months, we've seen this in this House, their attempts at evasion and cloaking the truth. Even independent transparency experts have criticized this government for its deteriorating commitment to transparency. Mr. Speaker, how can we expect to work towards transparency when the government is unable to set a good example of what that should look like? Mr. Speaker, why should we settle for transparency for everyone except the Conservatives? On this side of the House, we believe in a regime of transparency and accountability that applies fairly to all aspects of federal government. This is clearly not the view that is shared by my colleagues across the aisle. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that we can all agree that this is one of the utmost important that CBC remain accountable to Canadians. However, it is also important that CBC is able to protect its journalistic, programming, and creative activities in order to perform and deliver in this marketplace. This bill will make protection of that information significantly difficult and will threaten CBC's competitiveness and its ability to produce investigative journalism. I think, Mr. Speaker, it is important to acknowledge, first of all, that the CBC has taken measures to improve its access to information operations dramatically. In fact, the Information Commissioner, in her 2011-2012 report card, remarks that CBC has had, and I quote this, achieved an achieved an outstanding level of compliance and awarded the CBC an A grade for its performance under the Access to Information. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, the CBC proactively discloses information to the public beyond what is required. The CBC's improvement in this area are even more impressive when compared to federal government's own appalling performance in this regard. The amendments in this bill would repeal the exclusion from the Access to Information Act of CBC's information related to journalistic, creative and programming activities, and instead replace it with an exemption, Mr. Speaker. Under this exemption, the CBC will be required to demonstrate that the disclosure of a record would reasonably be expected to prejudice the corporation's journalistic, creative and programming independence. Currently, the Office of the Information Commissioner reviews the requested documents to ensure that the information relates to protected activities, then makes a decision. Under the proposed exemption, the CBC will be required to turn over documents as well as legal arguments outlining how release of this information would cause injury to the CBC. This places an undue and unfair burden on the CBC and will open the door to damaging requests as well as needless and expensive legal battles, Mr. Speaker. No other broadcaster is subject to similar measures. It is clear to see that these amendments would seriously threaten CBC's journalistic operations. The majority of the CBC's access to information requests are already come from its competitors, Mr. Speaker. This amendment will only serve to exaggerate the situation and force CBC to spend more time and effort protecting information relating to journalistic, creative and programming activities from its direct competitors. Why, Mr. Speaker, would we want to expose our public broadcaster to this extra burden that will seriously threaten its competitiveness? These amendments, Mr. Speaker, are unnecessary. CBC has already demonstrated excellent compliance with the Access to Information Act, and the Federal Court of Appeal has already settled this matter to the satisfaction of both Information Commissioner and the CBC. There is absolutely no need to place an additional burden on our public broadcaster, CBC, Mr. Speaker. At the risk of sounding like a broken record, Mr. Speaker, I must point out the hypocrisy of this bill. How is it, Mr. Speaker, that the Conservatives can expect CBC to adhere to an even more demanding access to information procedure when they aren't even performing to the level that CBC is? This is truly perplexing to me, Mr. Speaker. This bill is backdoor attack on the CBC, targeting its ability to remain competitive and independent. The Conservatives have demonstrated with their amendments to the bill that they are not committed to ensuring transparency on salary disclosure. I agree that the CBC must remain accountable to Canadians, but this bill hinders its ability to protect journalistic, programming and creative activities, which will negatively impact its ability to perform and deliver in the marketplace, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I believe that the CBC should remain a strong, independent public broadcaster. The bill demonstrates that the Conservatives clearly do not feel the same way, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.